Hey guys, tonight let's all do that thing where we dim the lights, put the phone face down, maybe lower the volume just a touch too much, and let history mumble softly in the background while your brain slowly powers down. This evening's topic is oddly practical, a little grim, but in a very old, very tired way. Tonight, we're talking about how people disposed of bodies before modern forensics, before crime labs, before DNA, before anyone owned a decent flashlight or asked inconvenient questions. This is not a true crime episode. No shocking twists, no dramatic reveals, just a long, slow wander through the past where people had problems, made questionable choices, and then tried very hard to move on with their lives. So get comfortable, because history, as always, was doing its best with what it had. Now, when we imagine the past, we often assume people were either wildly barbaric or suspiciously clever. In reality, they were mostly tired, under-resourced, and extremely committed to not getting caught. And for most of human history, disposing of a body wasn't about foolproof methods, it was about convenience, plausible deniability, and hoping nobody noticed. Let's start very simply. The oldest, most popular, and least imaginative solution was the hole. Humans have been digging holes since forever. Holes for food, holes for shelter, holes for things we didn't want to think about anymore. In prehistoric and early ancient societies, burial was often shallow, inconsistent, and mostly symbolic. Sometimes it was respectful, sometimes it was hurried, sometimes it was just, well, this is far enough. There was no standard depth, no universal ritual, just dirt, rocks, and maybe a stick to mark the spot if someone felt sentimental. If the death was expected, the body might be arranged carefully. If it wasn't, the ground did a lot of heavy lifting. And of course, shallow graves came with problems. Animals, erosion, the occasional unpleasant rediscovery. But remember, nobody was scanning the soil for clues. If something resurfaced years later, people shrugged, crossed themselves, and decided it must be ancient business, which technically it was. As societies grew more organized, cities formed, and populations increased, holes became less practical. You can only dig so many graves before someone asks why the ground looks like a poorly maintained golf course. So people turned to another favorite: water. Rivers, lakes, marshes, and coastlines were the ancient world's all-purpose disposal system. Flowing water meant distance. Distance meant uncertainty. Uncertainty meant peace of mind. If something went into a river, it was no longer your problem. It was the river's problem, and rivers famously do not testify. In ancient Mesopotamia, bodies were often consigned to the Euphrates or Tigris, sometimes as punishment, sometimes as convenience, sometimes because burial space was limited and water was right there. In ancient Rome, the Tiber was doing a lot of unspoken work. Executed criminals, the poor, the unclaimed, and the inconvenient all had a tendency to end up there. Romans even had a phrase for it. To be thrown into the Tiber wasn't just disposal, it was social erasure. No funeral, no marker, just movement downstream and out of memory. And because this was before modern sanitation, people were already using rivers for everything else: drinking, bathing, washing clothes, dumping waste. One more body didn't exactly stand out. Now, occasionally, bodies washed back up. Rivers are rude like that. But unless the person was famous, powerful, or very obviously murdered in public, it rarely triggered an investigation. At most, it triggered gossip. And gossip, in pre-literate societies, had the lifespan of a bored afternoon. Let's float gently over to ancient Egypt for a moment, because Egypt complicates things. Egyptians loved bodies. They absolutely adored them, preserved them, wrapped them, labeled them,
built entire economies around making sure bodies stayed exactly where they were supposed to be. But even Egypt had exceptions. If you were poor, nameless, or inconvenient, mummification was not in the budget. Many people were buried in the sand, where natural desiccation did most of the work. Others were placed in mass graves during plagues or disasters. Efficiency quietly overtook ceremony. And criminals, enemies of the state, or disgraced officials sometimes received deliberately improper burials. No preservation, no afterlife paperwork, which to an Egyptian was worse than death. Elsewhere in the ancient world, exposure was another option. This was especially common in places where digging was difficult or soil was uncooperative. In parts of Persia, Central Asia, and later among Zoroastrian communities, bodies were left out in the open, on towers, on hills, anywhere animals and birds could handle the situation. This wasn't considered disrespectful, it was practical and religious. The body was viewed as empty, a shell. Nature could have it back. From a forensic standpoint, this method erased most evidence very quickly. Scavengers are thorough, and they do not leave neat timelines. In ancient Greece, things were a little more performative. Burial was important, funerals mattered, but again, that depended on status. Enemies, traitors, and criminals could be denied burial altogether. Bodies might be dumped outside city walls, left in fields, or placed in unmarked pits. And if someone died mysteriously, well, people noticed, they whispered, they moved on. There was no CSI Athens, just a vague sense that the gods would sort it out eventually. Now, let's drift gently into the early modern Europe, because this is where things get particularly improvisational. Medieval Europe had burial norms, sure. Churchyards, blessed ground, graves packed together like a badly organized parking lot. But churchyards filled up fast, and expanding them required money, permission, and effort. So when space ran out, old graves were reused, bones were moved, skulls were stacked neatly in charnel houses. Death was not private, it was logistical. If someone died unexpectedly or inconveniently, the solution was often speed, a quick burial, a field, a forest edge. Forests, by the way, were excellent for this. Dense, poorly mapped, full of natural explanations for missing people. "Oh, he went into the woods and never came back," was a complete sentence for centuries. Wolves, bandits, weather, God's will, no follow-up questions. Castles added their own quirks. Large stone buildings had wells, cellars, ditches, and walls thick enough to absorb mistakes. It was not unheard of for bodies to be dropped into unused wells or sealed behind masonry, out of sight, out of smell eventually. And if renovations uncovered something decades later, it was usually attributed to some long-forgotten feud, which was probably correct. Let's not forget monasteries and convents, places of peace, silence, and extremely limited external oversight. Most deaths there were natural, but not all. Burials happened on site, records were minimal, and internal discipline was rarely questioned by outsiders. If something went wrong, it stayed inside the walls. Now, let's take a very slow stroll through cities. Medieval cities were crowded, loud, and permanently unsanitary. Dead animals were common, human waste was everywhere. Smells blended together into one continuous sensory experience. So, if a body appeared in an alley, it was disturbing, but not unprecedented. Sometimes bodies were dumped at night in poor neighborhoods, sometimes near city gates, sometimes near hospitals or churches, hoping someone else would deal with it. And often, someone did, without asking who put it there. Mass graves were another solution, especially during plagues. When people were dying faster than they could be buried, efficiency replaced ceremony entirely. Bodies were stacked, covered, prayed over in bulk. During events like the Black Death, entire neighborhoods disappeared into pits. And once things stabilized, no one was eager to reopen that chapter. From a forensic standpoint, plagues were a perfect cover. Cause of death was assumed. No autopsies, no individual scrutiny, just exhaustion. Now let's gently shift over to execution grounds, because these served a dual purpose. Public executions were meant to be visible, educational, a warning. But afterward, the body was often an inconvenience. Some were claimed by families, some were sold to surgeons, some were buried in unmarked graves near the gallows. Others were left hanging or displayed until nature intervened. And once removed, remains were often buried nearby, shallowly, quickly, and without much care. Execution sites became layered with bodies over time, a kind of accidental archive of state violence.
All right, welcome back. If you drifted off a little, that's perfect. History does its best work when you're only half listening. Last time, we floated past holes, rivers, forests, and the general medieval strategy of out of sight, out of mind, and please don't ask. Now we ease forward into the early modern world, roughly the 1500s to the 1700s, a time when governments began caring a bit more. Paperwork started multiplying, and people still absolutely did not know what a fingerprint was. This is the awkward middle phase, too organized to be truly careless, not organized enough to be effective, which makes it fascinatingly messy. Let's start with cities, because cities are where problems accumulate. By the early modern period, European cities were larger, denser, and slightly more interested in regulation. They had watchmen, curfews, church records, occasional attempts at law enforcement. But they were still dark at night, still filthy, still confusing. And when someone died unexpectedly, disposal often relied on exploiting those weaknesses. One very popular option was the well. Wells were everywhere. Private courtyards, public squares, monasteries, castles. They were deep, vertical, poorly lit, and rarely inspected unless something went wrong, which it often did. Bodies placed in wells didn't stay hidden forever. Eventually, someone noticed the water tasted different, or smelled wrong, or made people sick, at which point the well would be drained and something unpleasant would be discovered. But here's the thing. By the time that happened, decomposition had erased most details. Identity was hard to confirm. Cause of death was guesswork. And responsibility, that was conveniently unclear. So wells became less about hiding forever and more about buying time. And time in the early modern world solved many problems. Another favorite option was walls. Old buildings were constantly being renovated, expanded, or repaired. Stone walls were thick, floors were layered, cellars went deep. If a body could be sealed into a wall or under a floor, it became part of the structure. There are countless later discoveries of skeletons behind plaster or beneath staircases, and almost every time the explanation was the same. Oh, that must be from a long time ago, which was usually true enough to satisfy everyone. Castles were especially good at this. They had forgotten rooms, unused passages, storage areas that hadn't been opened in generations. And when noble families argued, schemed, or quietly removed obstacles, the building itself often absorbed the evidence. Let's gently wander into early modern households. Large households were complicated ecosystems. Servants came and went, records were incomplete, social hierarchies discouraged questions. If a servant died, ran away, or disappeared, it was rarely investigated deeply. Employment was informal. People were transient. If someone stopped showing up, the assumption was that they'd moved on, or met an unfortunate but unremarkable end. Bodies could be buried on estate land, dumped in woods, placed in old outbuildings, and unless there was a scandal, it stayed quiet. Now let's talk about hospitals, which at the time were less about healing and more about containment. Early hospitals housed the poor, the sick, the elderly, and the dying. Death was routine. Bodies were removed constantly. Burials were frequent and often anonymous. If someone died under suspicious circumstances, it blended easily into the background noise of mortality. Records were minimal. Oversight was light. And during epidemics, everything accelerated. Plague pits returned again and again. Bodies wrapped hastily, thrown together, covered quickly. No names, no individual attention. From a disposal perspective, epidemics were grimly efficient. Now let's slow down and talk about roads, because travel increased in the early modern period. Merchants, pilgrims, soldiers. People were always on the move, and when someone died along the way, especially far from home, their fate depended on circumstance. Roadside burials were common, bodies left near inns, placed in ditches, covered with stones. If the deceased was unknown, the local community handled it as quickly as possible. There was no incentive to investigate, only to clear the road and move on. And if a traveler disappeared entirely, that was expected. Roads were dangerous, bandits existed, accidents happened, which made roads excellent places to lose someone permanently. Now let's talk about water again, because people never stopped loving water as a solution. By this point, canals were common, ports were busy, harbors were crowded with ships. Bodies thrown into water near ports could disappear quickly. Currents, tides, ships coming and going. If something washed ashore, it was often unrecognizable. Sailors died constantly. Drownings were common, and sailors themselves were frequently buried at sea. No investigation, no follow-up. The ocean was vast and deeply uninterested in human paperwork. Let's gently drift into courts and justice briefly. Early modern courts relied heavily on confessions and witness testimony. Physical evidence was secondary, which meant that even if a body was found, the case hinged on who people believed. Status mattered. Reputation mattered. A noble explanation carried more weight than a peasant accusation. If someone powerful claimed innocence, the investigation often ended there, which meant that disposal didn't have to defeat science. It just had to survive social pressure. Now, something subtle starts to change in this period. Governments begin keeping better records. Parish registers track baptisms, marriages, and deaths. This creates a problem. When someone disappears without a recorded death, questions occasionally arise, so disposal strategies adapt. Instead of making bodies vanish entirely, people sometimes arranged official deaths, a burial without a body, a declaration of death based on circumstance. Shipwrecks were especially useful. So were wars. If someone was last seen heading into battle, that was enough. The body didn't need to be produced, which from a very tired administrative perspective was ideal. Now let's gently slide into colonial contexts, because this is where oversight becomes even thinner. In colonies, populations were scattered. Records were inconsistent. Authority was distant. Bodies could disappear into wilderness, forests, deserts. Indigenous burial practices were often misunderstood or ignored, allowing settlers to obscure deaths within cultural confusion. If someone died violently in a remote area, the chances of investigation were slim. Distance protected secrets. Now, let's pause for a moment and talk about the smell, because smell mattered. Before modern chemistry, smell was one of the few indicators that something was wrong, which meant that disposal often focused on reducing odor. Lime was commonly used, not because people understood decomposition scientifically, but because lime was associated with cleanliness. Bodies covered in lime broke down faster.
Smell reduced. Details obscured. It wasn't foolproof, but it helped. Fire was another option, but cremation wasn't widely practiced in Christian Europe for religious reasons. Burning a body was suspicious, unusual, which made it risky, unless it happened accidentally. House fires were common. Entire buildings burned regularly. If someone died in a fire, the cause was assumed. Remains were difficult to analyze. Fire erased stories very efficiently. Now, as we approach the late 1700s, something important begins to shift. Doctors start paying attention. Anatomy advances. Autopsies become more common. Not everywhere, not consistently, but enough to create anxiety. Suddenly, bodies matter more. Details matter more. And disposal becomes slightly more complicated. But for now, in this gentle middle period, the world still runs on assumptions. People believe what fits their expectations, and bodies, once inconvenient, quickly become anonymous. In the next part, we'll drift into the 18th and 19th centuries, where science begins waking up, cities grow crowded beyond control, and people start realizing, slowly, reluctantly, that the dead might have opinions. For now, just rest here. Let the paperwork pile up. Let the wells stay sealed. And let history continue its quiet habit of looking away.
All right, welcome back again. If part 2 faded gently into the background while your thoughts wandered off somewhere else, that's exactly the correct experience. History rarely minds being ignored. Now we drift into the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a strange transitional era. The world starts paying attention, but not all at once, and not very confidently. This is the age where people begin to suspect, quietly, that bodies might actually mean something. Cities grow larger, streets get marginally better lighting, paperwork multiplies, and suddenly death starts leaving a paper trail, which is inconvenient. Parish records become more standardized, death certificates appear. Doctors are asked to sign things, not always accurately, but with confidence. This creates a problem for anyone hoping to make a body quietly disappear. So disposal methods evolve again, not dramatically, just creatively. Let's start with urban overcrowding, because this drives almost everything. By the early 1800s, cities like London, Paris, and Vienna are packed. People live stacked on top of each other. Basements are occupied, attics are rented, yards are gone, and burial grounds completely full. Churchyards are overflowing, literally. Bodies are buried so shallow that coffins collapse, bones surface, graves are reused endlessly. This leads to a strange situation where moving bodies becomes normal. Graveyards are cleared, remains are transferred to catacombs or mass ossuaries, which means bones are constantly in transit. And when bones are constantly in transit, it becomes very easy for one extra set to slip in unnoticed. Paris, famously, relocates millions of skeletons into underground tunnels, skulls stacked neatly, femurs arranged decoratively. No names, no identities, just volume. From a disposal perspective, this is almost perfect. Now let's talk about night soil men, because they play a quiet role in this story. These were workers who removed human waste from privies at night. They moved through cities after dark. They had carts. They accessed backyards and basements. They were invisible, despised, and rarely questioned, which made their routes useful for moving anything unpleasant that needed to go away quietly. Not officially, but conveniently. Anything that disappeared into the waste economy was not coming back for questions. Now let's drift into houses themselves, because domestic architecture starts changing. Basements become deeper, floorboards are layered, walls are renovated repeatedly. Urban homes are remodeled over decades, and as before, bodies sometimes become part of the structure.
But now, instead of being medieval mysteries, they become urban legends. Skeleton found behind a wall, bones under the stairs. Everyone assumes it's old, even if it's not. Time does a lot of social work here. Now let's talk about medical schools, which complicate things in a new way. Doctors want bodies. Cadavers are valuable. Legal supply is limited. Demand is not. So grave robbing becomes a profession. Resurrection men, night diggers. They steal bodies from fresh graves and sell them to anatomists, which means bodies are already being moved illegally at night through cities without records. So if a body is missing from a grave, it might just be medical education. And if a body appears in a dissection room with unclear origins, well, no one wants to ask too many questions. This creates a fog of deniability that lasts for decades. Now let's step gently into rural areas because things remain slower there. Villages still rely on reputation and familiarity. Everyone knows everyone, which sounds safer, but it also means disappearance is easily explained. He left. She went to stay with relatives. He was always a strange one. Bodies buried on farmland are unlikely to be found unless the land is disturbed, and land often isn't. If something is found, it's usually blamed on an old war, an ancient crime, or someone long dead. The past absorbs responsibility very efficiently. Let's talk briefly about wars, because wars simplify everything. The late 18th and early 19th centuries are full of them. Revolutions, Napoleonic campaigns, colonial conflicts. Bodies disappear constantly. Soldiers die far from home. Records are incomplete. Mass graves are common. If someone vanishes during wartime, that's explanation enough. Even civilians killed during unrest are often folded into the general chaos. War erases detail, which is why it has always been a convenient curtain. Now, something subtle but important is happening during this period. Coroners begin to appear more regularly. Not modern ones, not scientific ones, but officials whose job is to look at a body and say something, usually vague. They examine external signs. They ask neighbors questions. They write a report. But without toxicology, without pathology, they mostly confirm what people already believe. If death looks accidental, it is. If it looks natural, it was. Suspicion still relies on social cues. So disposal doesn't need to outsmart science yet. It just needs to match expectations. Now let's talk about fires again, because cities burn constantly. Wooden structures, open flames, overcrowding. Entire neighborhoods go up. If someone dies in a fire, remains are often unidentifiable. Burned bones look ancient. Charred remains erase context. Fire cleans paperwork as well as evidence. And after major fires, reconstruction begins quickly. Debris is cleared. Ruins are removed. Anything found during cleanup is assumed to belong to the disaster. Fire is very cooperative that way. Now let's slow down and talk about laundries, rivers, and industrial water. Industrialization pollutes waterways. Rivers become dumping grounds for waste. Fish die. Water darkens. So if something organic ends up in the water, it doesn't stand out. Bodies thrown into industrial rivers decompose faster due to chemicals and movement. And when remains wash up, they are often unrecognizable. Drownings are common. Work accidents happen. Again, assumptions do the work. Now we gently approach the mid-19th century, where things finally start getting uncomfortable. Science begins insisting on details. Pathology advances. Autopsies improve. Poison detection slowly emerges. And suddenly, bodies talk back. Not loudly, but enough to make people nervous. Which changes disposal strategies again. Instead of hiding bodies completely, people focus on normalizing death, keeping it domestic, keeping it ordinary. A death at home, a burial quickly arranged, a doctor who doesn't ask too many questions. Social pressure encourages speed. No delays, no examinations. The faster a body is buried, the less it can say. Which is why quick burial becomes emotionally framed as respectful, not suspicious. Now let's talk about cemeteries moving outside cities. This is a major shift. Urban burial grounds are deemed unhealthy. New cemeteries are built on the outskirts. This creates distance. Bodies are transported, handled by professionals, processed efficiently, which means families see less, ask less, and if something is wrong, it's already too late. The system absorbs anomalies quietly. Now, one last slow observation before we drift onward. Throughout all these centuries, the most effective disposal method has never been water, fire, or earth. It's been social indifference. If no one expects a body to appear, it doesn't need to be hidden well. If no one asks questions, answers don't matter. Modern forensics will eventually change this radically. But for now, in this half-awake world of lanterns and ledgers, death still slips through gaps. In the next part, we'll move closer to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, where science finally sharpens its teeth, criminals grow more anxious, and the dead become increasingly difficult to silence. But not yet. For now, let the city settle, let the paperwork sleep, and let history keep doing what it does best: drifting.
All right, welcome back. If this is the part where your brain starts drifting in and out, that's perfect. Because part 4 is where history gets methodical. Not exciting, just persistent. We're now moving into the late 19th century and early 20th century, roughly the 1870s through the 1920s. An era where science doesn't burst through the door all at once, but instead clears its throat politely and starts rearranging the furniture. This is when the dead become inconvenient in a new way. Not because people suddenly stop hiding bodies, they don't, but because bodies begin leaving records that are harder to erase. Let's start with the biggest shift of all: timekeeping. Industrial societies become obsessed with schedules. Trains run on timetables, factories track hours, cities synchronize clocks. Which means deaths now happen at times, not just vaguely overnight or sometime last week. Doctors record when they saw the patient last alive. Employers note when someone failed to show up. Neighbors notice patterns. Time becomes a witness. And that makes disposal more stressful. Now let's talk about death certificates, because they quietly change everything. By the late 1800s, many countries require official documentation for death: a name, a date, a cause. Doctors sign these, sometimes lazily, sometimes incorrectly. But once a cause is written down, it exists. And if the body doesn't match the paperwork later, questions start forming. Slowly, politely, but persistently. Which means the goal is no longer just to remove the body, it's to align the body with the story. Now enter forensic medicine. At first, it's unimpressive. Doctors examine wounds, estimate age, look at lividity, check for obvious trauma. Nothing dramatic. But even this basic attention makes sloppy disposal risky. A body pulled from water might show signs of injury before drowning. A burned body might reveal fractures unrelated to the fire. And suddenly, accidents feel less convincing. Let's slow down and talk about teeth, because teeth are annoying. Teeth survive fires. They survive decomposition. They survive most things. And dentists start keeping records, which means unidentified bodies can sometimes be identified. This is deeply inconvenient for anyone hoping anonymity would take care of things. Now let's gently wander through urban infrastructure because cities themselves become nosy. Sewers expand, streets are dug up, pipes are installed, which means ground that hasn't been disturbed in decades suddenly is. And when ground is disturbed, things are found. Skeletons beneath houses, bones under courtyards, remains beneath factories. And unlike earlier centuries, people don't automatically shrug and say,
ancient. They ask questions. Not dramatic ones, just uncomfortable ones. Who lived here before? How old are these bones? Why are they here? Sometimes answers are found, sometimes not. But the assumption of harmless age begins to weaken. Now let's talk about photography, because this changes perception. Crime scenes are photographed, bodies are documented visually, which means details are preserved: bruises, positions, surroundings. Photographs don't forget, and they don't soften stories over time. They just sit there, waiting. Now let's pause and look at transportation, because this alters disposal logistics again. Trains connect cities, cars appear, bodies can be moved farther, faster, which sounds helpful. But movement creates witnesses, tickets, schedules, someone notices. So while distance increases, invisibility decreases. Now let's talk about the countryside, because it briefly feels safer again. Rural areas still rely on local authority. Doctors are few, oversight is light. Bodies buried on farmland can still disappear quietly. But even there, newspapers arrive, telegraphs connect regions, news travels. A body found in one village might be reported elsewhere. Patterns emerge. Which brings us to newspapers quietly sharpening their teeth. Sensationalism grows. True crime becomes entertainment. Suspicious deaths sell papers, which means authorities feel pressure to investigate. Not thoroughly, but visibly. They need to be seen doing something. And this visibility changes behavior. Now let's talk about poisons, because this is where things get delicate. For centuries, poisoning was popular because it left few marks. But chemistry advances. Arsenic detection improves. Poisons leave traces. Not always, but often enough to cause anxiety. So bodies that might have once been quietly buried are now exhumed. Exhumed becomes a thing, and that's a nightmare. A body that was supposed to stay silent is suddenly back in daylight. Doctors examine organs, tests are run. Sometimes the body speaks, which means that burial is no longer the end of the story. It's just a pause. Now let's talk about insurance, because money complicates death. Life insurance requires proof, verification. Bodies matter financially now. A missing person is inconvenient. A confirmed death is profitable, which creates incentives to produce bodies, or stories, or both. This also means bodies are examined more carefully. Fraud investigations happen. Again, not always successfully, but often enough to unsettle old habits. Now let's slow down and talk about cremation, because it re-enters the conversation. Cremation becomes more accepted in the late 19th century, partly for hygiene, partly for space. And cremation solves many problems. No body, no future questions, which makes authorities cautious. In some places, cremation requires investigation or certification. They don't want evidence destroyed too quickly. This tension is new. For the first time, the state hesitates before letting a body disappear completely. Now let's gently wander through cemeteries, because they change again. Graves are numbered, records are kept. Bodies have addresses, which means moving remains requires paperwork, and paperwork creates trails. The dead are becoming documented citizens, reluctantly. Now let's talk about police forces, because this is where the tone shifts. Professional police departments form. Training improves. They don't solve everything, they miss a lot, but they show up, they ask questions, they look at patterns, which means disposal methods that relied on isolation start failing. A body found in the river is no longer just a drowning. It's a case. A skeleton found in a wall is news. And news attracts attention. Now let's talk about war again, because war still interrupts everything. World War I produces mass death on an industrial scale. Bodies vanish, records fail, mass graves return, and for a brief moment anonymity is restored. But after the war, identification becomes a priority. Dog tags, dental records. The dead are named whenever possible, which reinforces the idea that bodies should be identifiable, that anonymity is a problem to be solved, not accepted. Now let's drift into the early 20th century home, because this is where tension builds. Deaths at home are still common. Doctors visit. But doctors are more cautious. They know scrutiny exists. They know mistakes can haunt them. So they hesitate. They document. And this slows everything down, which is bad for anyone hoping to hurry things along. Now let's talk about autopsies, which become more standardized. Still not universal, still not perfect, but present. And once an autopsy happens, the body becomes a text. It can be read, interpreted, argued over, which means the body is no longer passive. It participates, reluctantly. Now let's make one final slow observation. By the early 20th century, disposal isn't just about hiding a body. It's about managing systems. Medical systems, legal systems, media systems. You're not hiding from a person anymore. You're hiding from a network. And networks remember, which brings anxiety. Mistakes linger. The past doesn't stay buried as easily. In the next part, we'll drift fully into the modern forensic age, where disposal becomes a high-stakes puzzle. Old methods fail dramatically, and people begin to realize, far too late, that the dead have become very good at telling stories. But not yet. For now, let the lantern dim, let the paperwork rest, let the city sleep. History, as always, will be waiting.
All right, welcome back. If you've made it this far, you're either very relaxed or very committed. Either way, history appreciates the company. Now we arrive at the mid-20th century into the early modern forensic age, roughly the 1930s through the late 1990s. This is the point where the old tricks don't vanish overnight, but they start failing quietly, one by one. Not with drama, with paperwork. This is where disposal stops being a practical problem and starts becoming an administrative nightmare. Let's begin with the biggest aesthetic shift of all: lighting. Police stations get brighter. Hospitals glow with fluorescence. Autopsy rooms are clean, white, and extremely unromantic. There's no candlelight, no shadowy assumptions. Everything is visible, and visibility makes people nervous. Now let's talk about standardization, because this is where things truly tighten. Death certificates become uniform. Forms are printed. Fields must be filled. Cause of death, time of death, location. You can't just write "passed away" anymore and move on. Someone checks the boxes. And once boxes exist, they can be compared. Which brings us to databases slowly forming behind the scenes. Missing persons lists, hospital admissions, unidentified remains. At first, these are local, then regional, then national, which means a body found in one place can be matched against a disappearance somewhere else. Not always successfully, but often enough to ruin the illusion of isolation. Now let's talk about fingerprints, because fingerprints are stubborn. They don't fade easily. They don't care about stories. By the mid-20th century, fingerprints are standard in law enforcement. Criminals are indexed, soldiers are printed, employees are logged. So an unidentified body is no longer truly unidentified. It's just unmatched, for now. And for now becomes shorter every year. Now let's drift gently into transportation, because this both helps and hurts. Cars are everywhere. Highways stretch across countries. Bodies can be moved quickly, quietly, and far. But gas stations have attendants. Motel clerks exist. Receipts accumulate. Movement leaves traces, and the faster society moves, the more it records itself. Which brings us to receipts, the quiet enemies of disappearance. Credit cards appear. Transactions are logged. If someone stops using money suddenly, it's noticed. If someone keeps using it after they're gone, it's noticed even more. The absence and presence of activity both become suspicious. Now let's talk about telephones, because phones change timing. People call to check in, to confirm, to ask questions. If someone doesn't answer, it's noted. Silence acquires meaning, and when silence stretches too long, it invites attention. Now we gently step into medical science, which has been sharpening quietly. Autopsies are routine. Toxicology improves. Poisons that once slipped through unnoticed now leave chemical signatures. Doctors don't need to know what happened exactly. They just need to know that something doesn't fit. And doesn't fit becomes enough to pause everything, which is dangerous for any story that relies on speed. Now let's talk about burial practices, because even these change. Cemeteries are regulated. Funeral homes are licensed. Bodies are logged at every step: arrival, preparation, burial, or cremation. The chain of custody becomes real, which means a body can't simply vanish between death and disposal anymore. Someone notices. Someone signs something. Now, cremation becomes widespread in this era, and for a moment it looks like a return to simplicity. Ashes, finality. But cremation requires authorization. Medical examiners sign off. Waiting periods exist. Again, systems insert themselves between death and disappearance. Now let's slow down and talk about medical examiners, because they are not impressed by stories. They don't know the family. They don't care about reputation. They see bodies all day, which means they notice patterns: bruises that don't match falls, wounds that don't match accidents. They don't always pursue them aggressively, but they document them. And documentation is permanent. Now let's drift into media, which becomes relentless. Radio, television, 24-hour news. A body found isn't just a local matter anymore. It's a headline, a segment, a photograph. Which means mistakes are replayed, questions are replayed, and public curiosity is hard to shut down once it wakes up. Now let's talk about war again, briefly, because war still disrupts everything. World War II produces massive displacement, missing persons everywhere. For a while, the old chaos returns, but afterward, identification becomes sacred. Dog tags, records, graves carefully marked. The dead are named whenever possible, and this reinforces the idea that anonymity is a failure, not an outcome. Now let's gently enter the late 20th century, where things truly tighten. Computers arrive, slowly, clumsily, but once they do, records stop sleeping in filing cabinets. They talk to each other. A missing person report can be cross-referenced, dental records compared, fingerprints matched, and bodies that once would have stayed silent now get names decades later, which is deeply unsettling. Now let's talk about DNA, because DNA ends the conversation. Not immediately, not dramatically, but definitively. DNA doesn't care about time, or burial, or water. It waits. A bone fragment, a tooth, a drop of blood. Suddenly the past is readable. Bodies long disposed of resurface as data points. Families are contacted, stories unravel, which means disposal is no longer permanent. It's just delayed. Now let's slow down and talk about exhumation, because this becomes normalized. Cold cases reopen. Graves are dug up.
The assumption that burial equals closure disappears. Bodies are temporary residents of the earth, which makes Earth a very unreliable accomplice. Now, something important happens psychologically. People realize that the dead can outlive the lie, that time is no longer protection, which changes behavior. Disposal becomes more elaborate, more anxious, but also more error-prone. Complex plans fail more easily than simple ones ever did. Now let's talk about the modern city because it is saturated with observation. Cameras appear, at first few, then many. Streets, stores, elevators. Movement is recorded constantly, which means disappearance requires avoiding being seen at all, and that is exhausting. Now let's talk about the countryside again briefly. Rural isolation still offers some cover, but even there satellites exist. Phones ping towers. The Earth itself is mapped. There are fewer blank spaces to hide things in. Now let's gently consider bureaucracy because this becomes the final obstacle. Every system overlaps with another. Hospitals talk to police, police talk to media, media talks to the public, which means inconsistencies echo. A wrong date, a missing signature. Small errors trigger large responses. Now let's make one final, very slow observation. Throughout all of history, bodies were disposed of using silence. Silence from witnesses, silence from records, silence from society. Modern forensics breaks silence. Not loudly, not dramatically, just persistently. It replaces forgetting with remembering, which means the modern world is not better because people are kinder or wiser. It's better because forgetting has become difficult. And that is the real shift. Bodies didn't change. People didn't change. Systems did. And systems are very bad at letting things go. In the final part, we'll gently pull back and look at what this long arc tells us, not about crime, but about attention, memory, and the strange human belief that time will solve problems for us. For now, though, let the fluorescent lights dim, let the databases rest, let the filing cabinets close. History has said enough for tonight.
All right, welcome back. This is the last stretch. If your mind has been drifting in soft loops by now, that's fine. This part is meant to feel like the end of a long train ride. Nothing new rushing past the window, just the slow realization that you're almost home. Tonight, we're not adding new methods, no fresh techniques, no clever workarounds, because by the modern era, there really aren't any left that stay clever for long. Instead, this final part is about what all of this actually means. Not morally, not dramatically, just structurally. Because if you step back far enough, this entire history isn't really about bodies at all. It's about attention. For most of human history, attention was scarce, short-lived, localized. People noticed what was in front of them, what affected their neighbors, what disrupted daily routines. Everything else faded quickly, and bodies, once removed from sight, faded too. A missing person became a story, then a rumor, then nothing. Not because people were cruel, but because life moved forward loudly and relentlessly. The past had no storage space. Now let's slow down and talk about forgetting, because forgetting used to be the default. For thousands of years, forgetting was not a failure, it was a feature. Records decayed, memories blurred, witnesses died, time erased edges. And societies relied on that erasure to function. Conflicts ended because people stopped remembering the details. Crimes dissolved because evidence softened. Bodies disappeared because no one could hold on to the story long enough. Which meant that disposal didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to last longer than attention. Now compare that to the modern world. Nothing forgets anymore. Databases don't age. Digital records don't blur. Photographs don't soften. They just sit there, waiting for someone to look again. Which means the timeline has flipped. Instead of attention being brief and memory being fragile, attention is delayed and memory is permanent. The body no longer has to speak immediately. It can wait. Now let's talk about cold cases, because they embody this shift perfectly. A body found decades ago, filed away, forgotten. Then suddenly reopened. New techniques, new databases, new comparisons. A bone fragment becomes a name becomes a family, and the story resumes exactly where it stopped. Time no longer protects secrets, it preserves them. Which is deeply unsettling for a species that spent most of its existence relying on time to clean things up. Now let's gently revisit old methods, because they still exist, but hollowed out. Water still moves bodies. Earth still covers them. Fire still destroys detail. But none of these end the story anymore. They just postpone the chapter. A body in a river may be found miles away, but its DNA remains intact. A skeleton in a field might surface decades later during construction. Ashes might still contain traceable material. The elements no longer finish the job. They just hold on to it. Now let's talk about technology, because it quietly watches everything. Phones track location, cameras capture movement, transactions log behavior. Even absence becomes data. If someone disappears, the silence is recorded. Which means modern disappearance isn't about hiding something, it's about managing 1,000 tiny traces simultaneously. And humans are not good at that. We forget details. We contradict ourselves. We reuse patterns. Systems notice. They always do. Now let's slow down and talk about the psychology of disposal, because this hasn't changed much. Historically, people didn't want to erase bodies out of cruelty. They wanted to erase problems, scandals, inconveniences, shame. The body was just the physical reminder of something already unbearable. That impulse hasn't changed. What's changed is the environment it operates in. Modern systems don't allow quiet solutions. They insist on documentation, which forces confrontation. Now let's talk about closure, because this is where the modern world struggles. For most of history, closure was social, not factual. A body wasn't required. An explanation was enough. He died on the road. She didn't come back. He was lost at sea. Communities accepted these answers and moved on. Modern society demands precision, names, causes, proof, which sounds better, cleaner, but it also means stories stay open longer, uncertainty lingers, families wait, and the dead remain active participants in the present. Now let's gently acknowledge something uncomfortable. For most of history, many deaths were never meant to be solved. They were meant to be absorbed, and society was built to do exactly that. The modern world is not. It resists absorption. It insists on retrieval. Now let's talk about exhumation again, because this symbolizes this resistance. Digging up the past is no longer taboo, it's procedure. Graves are temporary agreements, which means burial is no longer an ending, it's a placeholder. Now this creates a strange tension. People still want finality, but systems don't provide it. Everything can be reopened, reanalyzed, reinterpreted. The dead are never truly at rest, which might explain why modern stories about disappearance feel more anxious. The possibility of resolution never fully goes away. Now let's gently zoom out. Across all 6 parts of this story, one pattern repeats endlessly. When oversight is low, bodies vanish easily. When oversight increases, bodies resist disappearance. Not because of morality, but because of infrastructure. Systems don't care about intent, they care about consistency. And bodies are inconsistent. They don't follow stories neatly. They contradict. They linger. Which brings us to the final, very quiet realization. Modern forensics didn't make people better.
It made forgetting harder, and forgetting was doing a lot of work for us. Now let's take one last slow breath and look at the long arc. Prehistory relied on nature, ancient worlds relied on water and earth, medieval societies relied on chaos, early modern states relied on assumptions, industrial cities relied on volume, the modern world relies on data, and data does not decay, it accumulates, which means the future will always have access to the past, even the parts we hoped would dissolve quietly. So when we ask, how did people dispose of bodies before modern forensics, the real answer isn't about rivers or graves or fire, it's about time. They didn't defeat evidence, they outlasted attention. And attention used to be short. Now it isn't. Which is why the old methods feel clumsy, why the past keeps resurfacing, why bodies long silent suddenly speak, not because they changed, but because we did. And with that, we can finally let this story rest. No cliffhanger, no reveal. Just a slow understanding that history didn't become more honest, it became more permanent. So dim the lights, let the last thought drift off, and allow the past to settle back into its uneasy, watchful quiet. This has been a long journey. And for tonight, that's enough remembering.
All right. If you're still here, welcome back. This is the part that exists mostly because history doesn't know how to stop talking once it gets comfortable. Part 6 wrapped things up neatly, which, historically speaking, is suspicious. So Part 7 is not a continuation in the forward sense. It's more like standing still and noticing the room you've been in the whole time. Because once you reach the modern world, something strange happens. The question is no longer how bodies are disposed of, it's why we're still so fascinated by the attempt. We already know the outcome. It rarely works. Not for long. Not anymore. And yet we keep circling the topic, quietly, obsessively, like a tongue worrying an old tooth. So let's talk about that. For most of human history, disposal was an act of confidence. Confidence that time would cooperate, that attention would wander, that memory would decay. Modern society, on the other hand, is deeply unsure. We don't trust time anymore. We don't trust forgetting. We archive everything because we're afraid of what happens if we don't, which creates a strange inversion. In the past, the body disappeared and the story survived. Now, the body survives and the story collapses under scrutiny. And this makes us uncomfortable, because we are still psychologically wired for a world where things fade. Now let's slow down and talk about the digital afterlife, because this is where bodies are no longer even required. People leave trails that continue long after they're gone. Social media profiles remain active, messages persist, photos resurface automatically. A person can disappear physically and remain socially present, which is deeply unsettling in a way no shallow grave ever was. The modern world doesn't let absence be clean, it keeps checking in. Now think about how strange this would seem to someone from the medieval world. To them, disappearance was physical first, social erasure followed naturally. Today, it's often the opposite. A person might vanish from daily life, but their data continues interacting with the world. Birthdays roll around, memories pop up, algorithms assume continuity. The dead are no longer silent, they're just inactive, which makes the idea of disposal feel almost outdated. What exactly are you trying to remove if the person still exists everywhere else? Now let's talk about true crime, because it's the cultural descendant of this entire history. True crime doesn't exist to solve mysteries. Most of the time, the outcomes are already known. It exists to rehearse uncertainty, to sit with unresolved questions in a safe, controlled way.
We return again and again to stories of disappearance, not because they're shocking, but because they clash with how our world is supposed to work now. People are not supposed to vanish. Systems are supposed to catch them. When that fails, it feels like a tear in reality, and we can't look away from tears. Now let's talk about forensic confidence, because this is another modern illusion. We like to believe that science always wins, that every body will eventually tell the truth. But that's not actually true. Forensics improves odds. It doesn't eliminate uncertainty. Errors happen. Bias exists. Evidence degrades. What's changed is not certainty, but expectation. We expect answers now, and when we don't get them, the discomfort lingers longer. In the past, uncertainty blended into daily life. Now it stands out sharply. Now let's slow down and talk about closure again, because we still don't know how to handle it. Modern culture promises closure as a product. Solve the case, name the remains, end the story. But history suggests that closure has never really worked that way. Even when answers exist, they don't always satisfy. Families still grieve, communities still speculate, questions still echo. The difference is that now the questions are documented. They don't fade into rumor, they remain searchable, which makes grief heavier in a quiet, persistent way. Now let's gently look back at the old methods one last time, but through a modern lens. Rivers once erased borders, now they preserve evidence downstream. Earth once sealed secrets, now it stores them until construction schedules reopen the past. Fire once simplified stories, now it triggers investigations. The elements didn't change their behavior, our interpretation did. Which brings us to a very subtle point. Modern forensics didn't conquer nature, it reframed it. Nature is no longer an ending, it's a delay mechanism, and delay is not the same as disappearance. Now let's talk about time again, because time is the real protagonist of this entire series. Time used to be an ally, now it's a liability. The longer something remains hidden, the more likely it is to be discovered later under better conditions by more persistent systems. Time no longer erases evidence, it preserves it for future tools, which means the past is never done being investigated, it's just waiting for upgrades. Now let's talk about the emotional side, quietly, because this often gets lost. For most of history, disappearance allowed communities to heal by forgetting. This wasn't kindness, it was survival. Modern society doesn't forget well. We revisit, reanalyze, reopen, which is admirable and exhausting. The dead never stop arriving in the present. Now let's step back one final time and look at the entire arc, from holes in the ground to databases in the cloud. From rivers carrying bodies away to servers carrying identities forever. From silence as protection to silence as suspicion. This isn't a story about crime, it's a story about visibility. The more visible a society becomes, the less room it has for disappearance. And visibility has a cost. It keeps wounds open, it prevents forgetting, it demands attention long after attention feels sustainable. Now here's the last quiet observation. The modern world did not make disappearance impossible, it made it incomplete. Something always remains, a record, a trace, a question. And that may be the most unsettling change of all, because humans evolved in a world where endings existed, where things stopped, where stories faded. Now we live in a world of permanent drafts. Nothing is ever fully resolved. Nothing is ever fully gone. Which brings us gently to the real end, not of this series, but of the illusion that time will take care of things for us. Time still moves, it just doesn't clean up anymore. So if this entire journey leaves you with a single soft takeaway, let it be this. History did not become more honest, It became more observable, and observation is relentless. Now you can let this go. Let the thoughts slow, let the details blur a little. You've already remembered enough for tonight. The past will still be there tomorrow. Quiet, patient, waiting.
All right. Welcome back one last time. If this feels like the part that exists purely because the night hasn't quite decided to end yet, you're not wrong. Part 8 is the soft afterthought, the quiet, sitting on the edge of the bed moment after the story is technically over, but your mind hasn't powered down. Nothing new is introduced here, no fresh eras, no additional systems. This part is about living with the knowledge that came before it. Because once you've followed this long, slow trail from dirt and rivers to databases and clouds, you can't quite unsee the pattern. And the pattern is simple. Human beings did not change very much. What changed was what followed them. For most of history, people moved faster than their shadows. Now, the shadow arrives first and waits. That's the modern condition. Let's start gently with something deceptively small, the pause after death. In older societies, death was loud and immediate. Someone died, and the world responded right away. Bodies were handled quickly, stories formed fast, explanations settled in. The moment passed. Today, death creates a pause. Paperwork waits. Notifications stall. Accounts freeze. There is a moment where nothing moves forward because everything needs to be verified. This pause didn't exist before, and in that pause, questions gather. Now let's slow down and talk about waiting, because waiting is the modern version of disappearance. We wait for results, for confirmations, for matches. The body no longer disappears into the environment. It disappears into processing, which feels calmer, cleaner, but it's also strangely unsettling, because processing implies continuation. The story isn't over, it's pending. Now think about how this alters grief. For centuries, grief was tied to presence, a body seen, a burial attended. Modern grief often happens without those anchors. People grieve files, timelines, case numbers. They grieve while waiting, which stretches sorrow into something thinner but longer lasting. Now let's talk about memory, because memory used to be personal. Stories passed between people. They softened with repetition. They changed shape. Memory decayed naturally. Modern memory doesn't. It replicates. Screenshots, backups, archives. Even when people forget emotionally, systems remember mechanically, which creates a disconnect. You can move on internally while the external world keeps nudging you backward. A name resurfaces, a file updates, a case reopens. The past taps you on the shoulder, gently, persistently. Now let's talk about the myth of completeness, because this is something modern culture quietly promises, that every case will be solved, every body identified, every story finished. History suggests otherwise. What actually happens is that answers accumulate unevenly. Some questions close neatly, others remain open forever. And the presence of advanced tools makes the unsolved ones feel heavier, not lighter. Because now, unsolved doesn't mean impossible. It means unfinished. Now let's slow down and talk about the dead themselves, because they have changed roles. They are no longer just the end of a story. They are evidence, data points, anchors. The body isn't just mourned, it's consulted. And that creates a strange tension. Respect asks us to let the dead rest. Knowledge asks us to wake them up. Modern society leans towards knowledge, quietly, relentlessly. Now think about how different this is from the medieval world.
Back then, disturbing a grave was shocking, sacrilegious. Now, it's procedural, authorized, scheduled. The earth opens on appointment. This doesn't mean modern people are crueler. It means certainty is valued more than stillness. Now let's talk about attention, one final time, because it's the thread connecting everything. Attention used to be scarce. Now it's constant. Someone is always looking, always watching, always recording, which means disappearance requires coordination across systems designed to prevent it. And coordination is difficult, especially for the careless. Now let's talk about why we still tell these stories, because this is important. We don't revisit old disappearances to learn techniques. We revisit them to understand failure, to reassure ourselves that the world, despite its complexity, still has edges, that not everything is known, that mystery survives. These stories soothe us because they prove that total visibility hasn't arrived yet. There are still blind spots, and that's oddly comforting. Now let's slow down and talk about sleep, because this channel exists for a reason. Sleep is the last place where stories dissolve without needing resolution. Your mind lets go, details blur, chronology loosens. Sleep is what history used to have naturally, a long forgetting, which is why these slow, quiet stories work so well at night. They recreate the old rhythm. Listen, drift, forget. Now let's step back and look at the entire journey one final time. Part 1 showed us a world where nature absorbed everything. Part 2 showed us structures hiding mistakes. Part 3 introduced paperwork and suspicion. Part 4 brought science into the room. Part 5 sealed the doors with data. Part 6 questioned what permanence does to us. Part 7 sat with the discomfort of knowing too much. And Part 8 lets us rest. Because at the end of all this, the conclusion isn't frightening, it's simply heavy. Modern society carries its past instead of burying it. That weight slows us down. It makes us cautious, sometimes anxious. But it also means fewer stories vanish without a trace. Now here's the final, very soft realization. The past didn't become louder. We just stopped walking away from it. And that choice, to keep looking, to keep recording, to keep asking, comes with a cost. The cost is rest. So tonight, let yourself do what earlier centuries did naturally. Let the details fade. Let the timelines blur. Let the systems sleep. The past will still be there tomorrow. It always is. For now, though, it's enough to have noticed it. Dim the lights, lower the volume, and allow history, finally, to drift back into its quiet. You've listened long enough.
Hey guys, welcome back. Settle in again. Adjust the pillow, lower the screen brightness just a bit more than necessary. This part exists because sometimes the night doesn't want a conclusion. It wants a long exhale. Part 9 is not about new methods, new eras, or new discoveries. It's about what happens after we stop investigating, which is a strangely under-discussed phase of history. Because eventually, even the most persistent systems get tired. Cases cool, files close, servers archive, and the world gently moves on. Let's begin there. For all our modern confidence, most stories do not end with certainty. They end with silence returning. Not dramatic silence, administrative silence, the kind where no one is officially assigned to care anymore. This is where history has always lived, in the space after attention leaves. In the centuries before modern forensics, this moment came quickly. A season passed, a generation forgot, A name stopped being spoken. Now it comes slower, but it still comes. And when it does, something interesting happens. The past doesn't disappear. It settles, like dust. Now let's talk about forgotten remains, because not every body becomes a case study. Some are cataloged imperfectly. Some are misfiled. Some are identified incorrectly and never revisited. This isn't failure, it's inevitability. Even the best systems are run by tired humans with limited time and funding. Which means the idea of total resolution was always a fantasy. Modern tools didn't eliminate uncertainty, they just postponed it. Eventually, the questions stop being urgent. Now let's slow down and talk about generational distance, because this is where emotion fades. The first generation grieves personally. The second remembers vaguely. The third knows the story only as a reference. By the fourth, the story becomes abstract. And abstraction is where history finally rests. Not solved, not erased, just no longer heavy. This process hasn't changed since antiquity. What changed is how long it takes. Now think about how this affects the way we consume historical stories today. We binge documentaries, we scroll archives, we revisit cases endlessly. But eventually, even we move on. Another story replaces it. Another mystery fills the space. This isn't disrespect, it's rhythm. History has always depended on attention cycles. Now let's talk about places, because places remember differently than people. Rivers continue flowing long after stories end. Fields regrow. Buildings change purpose. A place that once held significance becomes ordinary again. Children play there. Commuters pass through. And nothing about the location insists on remembrance. This is one of history's quietest truths. Most significant events happen in places that later become boring. Now think about how unsettling that is. The dramatic fades into the mundane. The extraordinary becomes background. And that's how the world keeps functioning. Now let's talk about records, because records are the modern substitute for memory. Records don't feel grief. They don't age emotionally. They wait. And waiting is not the same as remembering. A file can exist forever without meaning anything to anyone, which is why archives are both comforting and sad. They promise preservation, but not relevance. Now let's gently acknowledge something uncomfortable. There are stories that should fade, not because they don't matter, but because they've already done their work. They've warned, they've taught, they've echoed enough. Holding on to everything indefinitely isn't wisdom, it's exhaustion. Now let's slow this down even further and talk about the human need for endings, because this is where our expectations often clash with reality. We want closure, we want conclusions, but history is not a novel. It doesn't care about satisfying arcs. It stops when people stop paying attention. And that's okay. That's natural. Now think about earlier societies again. They didn't obsess over perfect understanding. They accepted gaps. Mystery wasn't a failure, it was a condition of life. Modern culture treats mystery as a problem to solve, but maybe it's just something to live with. Now let's talk about the emotional weight of knowing, because this is what you've been carrying through these parts. Knowing how bodies were hidden, knowing how systems evolved, knowing how mistakes linger. Knowledge is heavier than ignorance.
That's not an argument against learning, it's just an acknowledgement. Which is why stories like this are best consumed slowly, at night, when nothing is demanded of you. Now let's step back and look at what this entire series was actually about, quietly. Not disposal, not crime. It was about how societies manage discomfort. When something doesn't fit neatly into daily life, we develop rituals, systems, and stories to contain it. Sometimes those systems are rivers, sometimes paperwork, sometimes databases. But the goal is the same: make the discomfort manageable. Now let's talk about rest, because this is where Part 9 gently insists we go. Rest is what history rarely gives itself. It keeps resurfacing, reframing, reopening. But individuals can choose rest. You don't have to carry every story to its conclusion. You're allowed to let some questions sit unanswered. That doesn't make you careless, it makes you human. Now think about the ancient world one last time. People lived with uncertainty constantly. They didn't expect the earth to explain itself. They accepted what they could see and moved forward. We've lost some of that ease. We traded it for knowledge, and knowledge, while powerful, is restless. Now let's slow this down even further. Imagine all the stories you didn't hear, the bodies never found, the questions never asked. Not as tragedies, just as quiet absences. They exist whether we focus on them or not, and the world continues regardless. This is not nihilism, it's balance. Now here's the last gentle idea to sit with tonight. History doesn't need us to hold everything. It needs us to visit, not to live there permanently. You've visited enough. You've walked the long path from earth to archive, from silence to scrutiny, from disappearance to documentation. And now it's time to leave the lights on low and step back. Let the past stay where it belongs. Not buried, not erased, just resting. So as you drift off, let the details soften, let names blur, let timelines untangle. History will still be there tomorrow. It always waits. For now, sleep. You've listened long enough.
Hey guys, welcome back. If you're here for part 10, you already know how this works. This is the point where the story isn't really a story anymore. It's a slow walk around a familiar room, touching the furniture one last time, just to confirm it's all still there. So get comfortable again. No rush. Nothing new is about to happen. Part 10 exists for one reason only, because even after 9 long parts, history still doesn't feel finished. And that's not a flaw, that's the point. Let's begin with something very ordinary, a light left on. In the modern world, lights stay on when no one is in the room. Servers hum, cameras blink, systems wait. Earlier societies turned lights off naturally. Night arrived and attention ended. Today, attention lingers, and that changes how the past behaves. For most of human history, the past went dark when people stopped talking about it. Now it just goes idle, which is not the same thing. Idle things can wake up. Now let's slow down and talk about habit, because habit is what keeps history alive more than intention. We don't actively choose to remember everything, we just keep checking. Search engines, databases, archives. Looking back becomes muscle memory. And habits are hard to break, especially when they feel responsible. Now think about how strange this would feel to someone from the ancient world. To them, remembering too much would seem unnecessary, maybe even unhealthy. They remembered what they needed to survive.
Everything else faded. Modern society remembers because it can, and capability is often mistaken for obligation. Now let's gently talk about the burden of completeness, because this is where modern history gets heavy. We want the full picture, the total account, the perfect reconstruction. But history has never been complete. It has always been fragments stitched together by people doing their best with limited information. The difference now is that we're aware of every missing piece, and awareness makes absence louder. Now let's slow this down further and talk about the end of disappearance, again, but from a softer angle. People still vanish, but now disappearance is provisional. It's temporary until proven otherwise, until a record updates, until data surfaces, until someone remembers to look again. This creates a strange emotional state. The past is never settled enough to rest and never active enough to resolve itself. It just waits. Now think about what this does to societies over time. Living with unresolved questions doesn't make people cruel. It makes them cautious, sometimes anxious, sometimes obsessive, sometimes tired. History, when constantly visible, becomes exhausting. Now let's talk about fatigue, because this is something historians rarely admit. There is such a thing as too much awareness, too many stories, too many unresolved threads. Eventually, the mind seeks quiet, not because it doesn't care, but because it has limits. Earlier societies reached quiet naturally. We have to choose it. Now let's revisit bodies one last time, not as evidence, not as mystery, but as presence. For centuries, bodies marked an ending. A funeral happened, a grave closed, life adjusted. Now bodies often mark a beginning, an investigation, a process, a sequence of steps. Death no longer concludes a story, it initiates paperwork, which is efficient and deeply unromantic. Now let's gently talk about romanticism, because we still crave it. We want the past to feel meaningful, ordered, symbolic. But the reality is quieter. Most historical outcomes are administrative. Files moved between desks, attention reassigned. History doesn't end with fireworks, it ends with emails. Now let's slow this down again and talk about acceptance, because this is where part 10 quietly lives. Acceptance is not the same as forgetting. It's the decision to stop demanding more than a story can give. Not every question gets answered. Not every body gets identified. Not every timeline closes neatly. This was true in the ancient world. It remains true now. The difference is that we notice it more. Now think about how this entire series started, with earth, water, fire, simple things doing what they've always done. Humans layered meaning on top. Systems replaced rituals. Records replaced memory. But the underlying reality stayed the same. Things end. Things decay. Things are left unfinished. Modern society didn't escape this. It just documented it. Now let's talk about the illusion of control, because this is where modern confidence quietly cracks. We like to believe that technology has tamed uncertainty, but all it's really done is slow it down. Questions take longer to fade, mistakes take longer to disappear, but they still exist, which means history hasn't been solved, it's just been extended. Now let's slow this down to its quietest point. Imagine a future far from now, our systems obsolete, our formats unreadable, our databases inaccessible. Someone looks back at us the way we look back at antiquity. Fragments, gaps, confusion. They will wonder what we missed, what we assumed would last forever. And in that moment, we'll feel very familiar, not advanced, not enlightened, just human. Now let's gently talk about why we keep returning to these stories, even when they make us tired. Because they reassure us that meaning exists somewhere in the mess, that effort matters, that paying attention is worthwhile, even if it doesn't solve everything. History doesn't reward us with certainty, it rewards us with perspective.
Now let's talk about letting go, because this is the quiet instruction Part 10 leaves behind. Letting go doesn't mean turning away permanently. It means stepping back long enough to breathe. The past doesn't need constant supervision. It survived centuries without us. It will survive nights without our attention. Now, if you've made it this far, you've done more than enough for one evening. You've walked the full arc, from disappearance to documentation, from silence to saturation, from forgetting to fatigue. And now, the only thing left is rest. So dim the lights one last time. Let the room go quiet. History doesn't end here, but your listening can. And that's okay. The past will remain exactly where you left it, waiting.
Hey guys, welcome back. If this were a physical place, this would be the hallway light, not the bright one, the small one you leave on so the house doesn't feel empty. Part 11 is not here to add weight. It's here to let some of it drain away. Because after 10 long parts of watching how history refuses to disappear, there comes a moment where even curiosity softens. Not because it's satisfied, but because it's tired. And tiredness, historically speaking, is how eras actually end. Let's begin with something very ordinary again. Closed doors. Every archive has rooms people stop entering. Every database has folders no one clicks anymore, not because the contents are solved, but because attention moved on. This is not neglect, it's how memory breathes. For most of human history, this happened naturally. A generation passed, then another. Eventually, the questions lost their sharpness. Now it takes longer, but it still happens. Even in the most documented societies, there are stories that slowly go quiet simply because no one needs them anymore. Now let's talk about questions, because questions age. At first, they're urgent, demanding, emotionally charged. Then they become historical, interesting but distant. Eventually, they become academic, footnotes, context. And finally, they become atmospheric, just part of the background hum of the past. This isn't failure, it's transition. Now think about how many questions from antiquity once felt unbearable. Where did they go? Why did this happen? Who was responsible? Those questions still exist, but they no longer hurt. Time didn't answer them, it softened them. Modern society resists this process. We archive pain as carefully as facts. We preserve urgency long past its natural lifespan, which is admirable and heavy. Now let's slow down and talk about emotional inflation, because this is something we rarely notice. When everything is remembered, everything competes for importance. Tragedies don't diminish, they pile up. And eventually, the mind begins to blur them together, not out of disrespect, but out of self-preservation. Earlier societies allowed emotional hierarchy. Some events mattered forever, some mattered for a while, some faded quickly. Modern culture tries to flatten that curve. Everything is significant, everything is preserved. And significance, when spread too thin, becomes exhausting. Now let's gently talk about forgetting, because forgetting has gotten a bad reputation. Forgetting is not erasure, it's digestion. It's how the mind turns experience into something livable. History, too, needs digestion. Without it, the past becomes indigestible, present tense forever. Now think about how this applies to bodies, again, but very softly. Not every set of remains carries the same story forever. At first, a body demands answers. Later, it represents a moment in time. Eventually, it becomes context. This is not disrespect. It's how meaning changes. The dead do not lose dignity when attention fades. They gain stillness. Now let's talk about stillness, because this is what modern systems struggle to allow. Systems are designed to process, update, revisit. Stillness feels like failure to them. But stillness is not absence of care. It's the acceptance that nothing more can be done right now.
and acceptance is a skill. Now let's drift for a moment into future historians, because they will inherit all of this. They won't see our era as hyper-aware. They'll see it as anxious. They'll notice how often we checked, rechecked, cross-referenced, how afraid we were of missing something. And they will sympathize, because anxiety leaves very recognizable patterns. Now let's talk about the illusion of permanence, again, but quieter this time. We believe digital records last forever, but formats change, servers fail, priorities shift. The future will lose more of our data than we expect. Not dramatically, just gradually. And one day someone will look at our time and say, "We don't really know what happened here." And that will be strangely comforting, because it means the past still behaves like the past. Now let's slow down and talk about why humans keep telling long stories at night, because this series exists for a reason. Night is when the mind stops trying to solve things. It becomes receptive instead of analytical. Stories told at night are not instructions, they're companionship. They remind us that we're not alone with our thoughts. History, when told softly, becomes less about facts and more about shared experience. Now let's revisit the theme of disposal one last time, but abstractly. Disposal was never really about hiding bodies. It was about managing discomfort. Modern society disposes of discomfort differently. We categorize it, we label it, we archive it, but we don't eliminate it. We just change where it lives. And that's okay. Now let's talk about limits, because limits are what Part 11 quietly respects. There is a limit to how much anyone can hold, a limit to how many stories deserve active attention, a limit to how much unresolved history a person can carry without becoming numb. Recognizing limits is not weakness, it's maturity. Now let's imagine something very simple. A historian closes a file, not because it's solved, but because it's enough for today. That moment rarely makes it into documentaries, but it's one of the most human moments in history. Now let's gently approach peace, because peace is not resolution. Peace is the decision to stop pushing, to let the unanswered remain unanswered without guilt. Earlier societies reached this point quickly. We take longer, but we still arrive. Now think about the entire arc of this series. We followed bodies through earth, water, walls, paper, labs, servers, and finally, memory. And memory, unlike systems, knows when to rest. It lets details blur. It allows silence. Which brings us to the quiet heart of Part 11. History does not demand constant vigilance. It asks for attention in waves. You've ridden a long one. Now it's receding. So tonight, let the rooms stay closed. Let the questions lose their edges. Let the past sit without commentary. It doesn't need defending. It doesn't need solving. It just needs to exist. And you don't need to watch it all the time. Dim the light again. Let the hallway glow be enough. History will still be there when you wake up. For now, rest. You've listened carefully. That's more than enough.
Hey guys, welcome back. If you've made it to Part 12, this isn't curiosity anymore. This is companionship. This is the part where the story knows you're here, but doesn't ask anything from you. No attention tests, no conclusions to remember, just presence. So settle in again. Let the room be dim. Let the night do most of the work. Part 12 exists in a strange space, not as an ending, not even as an epilogue. It's the long pause after the sentence, when no one rushes to speak next. And that pause matters. For most of human history, pauses happened naturally. Night fell. Fires burned low. Stories ended because sleep arrived. Modern life doesn't respect pauses very well, so sometimes we have to build them ourselves. This part is one of those. Let's begin with something very small. The moment when nothing is added. Historians are trained to accumulate more sources, more context, more cross-references. But there is a moment, rare and quietly uncomfortable, when adding more stops helping. The story doesn't become clearer, it just becomes louder. Earlier societies reached this moment without naming it. They stopped digging, stopped asking, stopped checking. Not because they didn't care, but because they understood limits instinctively. We've had to relearn that lesson slowly. Now let's talk about the difference between curiosity and obligation, because this is where modern history often gets tangled. Curiosity is light. It pulls you forward gently. Obligation is heavy. It presses down. At some point, looking back stops being curiosity and becomes duty. And duty drains the joy from understanding. Part 12 is about stepping out of duty. Not forever, just for tonight. Now let's slow everything down even further. Imagine a future night. Someone listens to a story like this. They don't know your time personally. They don't feel your urgency. They listen calmly. And that calmness is not disrespect. It's distance doing its work. That listener understands the past without carrying its weight. That is where history eventually wants to go. Now let's talk about why endings feel uncomfortable, because this series keeps resisting them. Endings imply finality, but life doesn't work that way. Things fade instead of ending. Questions soften. Details blur. This is not loss, it's transition. And transition doesn't need a dramatic moment. It just needs permission. Now let's gently grant that permission. You don't need to remember every method, every era, every observation. You don't need to hold the entire arc in your head. You've already absorbed what matters. The rest can drift. Now let's talk about sleep again, because sleep is the oldest form of forgetting. Not erasing, just loosening. Sleep allows the mind to reorder what it keeps, and stories told in this tone respect that process. They don't demand recall, they invite release. Now let's bring this part toward its quiet center. Not a conclusion, just a settling. History will always be there, waiting, patient. It doesn't panic when you leave. It doesn't worry about being forgotten. It has been forgotten many times before. And each time, it returned in a different shape. Now here's the final, very gentle thought Part 12 offers. You are not responsible for holding all of the past. You are allowed to visit it, learn from it, then step away. That is not carelessness. That is balance. So tonight, let this be enough. Let the lights stay low. Let the thoughts slow. Let the long journey you've been on come to rest without ceremony. No applause, no summary, just quiet. History doesn't need more from you right now. And neither do I. Good night.
Hey guys, welcome back. If this were a real night, this would be the hour when sleep already came and went once. The room is quiet, but you're still awake. Not restless, just floating. Part 13 lives there. Not at the edge of curiosity, not at the edge of endings. It exists in the soft middle, where nothing needs to be added, but nothing feels wrong if it lingers a little longer. So don't try to focus too hard. This part isn't going anywhere. Let's start with something gentle. The second silence. The first silence comes when a story ends. The second comes when you realize you don't need another one right away. Earlier societies lived in second silence constantly, between seasons, between generations, between questions that didn't demand answers yet. Modern life hates second silence. It fills it instantly. Noise, content, explanation. Part 13 refuses to do that. Instead, it sits. Now let's talk about what happens when history stops being informative and starts being familiar. At first, the past feels like a foreign country. Different rules, different rhythms. But after a while, patterns repeat. Power behaves the same. Fear behaves the same. People behave the same. The shock wears off, and familiarity arrives. This is where understanding deepens quietly, not through surprise, through recognition. Now, think about how many times across this series you've probably thought, "Oh, that sounds familiar." That's not boredom, that's connection. Now, let's slow down and talk about the comfort of patterns, because patterns are what allow the mind to relax. When things are unpredictable, the mind stays alert. When patterns emerge, the mind rests. History, told slowly, reveals patterns instead of shocks. That's why these stories work best at night. They reassure you that chaos has shape. Now, let's gently revisit the idea of disappearance again, but without tension. Earlier, disappearance felt like loss. Then it felt like failure. Then it felt like something that couldn't happen anymore. Now it just feels human. People come, people go. Sometimes neatly, sometimes not. The universe doesn't seem particularly upset about this. Humans are the ones who struggle. Now let's talk about struggle, but quietly. Most historical struggle isn't dramatic. It's slow, boring, administrative. People coping with systems that don't quite fit their lives, trying to make sense of outcomes that don't offer lessons neatly. That struggle doesn't look heroic. It looks tired. And tiredness is the most honest historical emotion. Now let's slow down even further. Imagine a person in the past, not a king, not a villain, just someone ordinary. They live, they worry, they adapt. Their story never gets recorded, and yet their existence shapes everything that follows. History is mostly made of these invisible lives, which is comforting. It means importance doesn't require recognition. Now, let's talk about recognition, because modern society equates recognition with meaning. If something isn't documented, it feels unreal. But for most of human existence, reality happened without witnesses. Meaning didn't need proof. Now, let's gently acknowledge something. Even this series will fade. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just slowly. Someone will remember parts, forget others. That doesn't diminish its value. It completes it. Now let's talk about completion, because completion doesn't mean closure. Completion means a thing has done what it needed to do. And this series has done that quietly. It slowed you down. It made you notice rhythm instead of events. That's enough. Now let's drift into time one more time, but without analysis. Time doesn't rush. It doesn't linger. It just moves. Earlier societies accepted this without commentary. We narrated constantly. But narration isn't required. Sometimes experience is enough. Now think about how rare it is today to sit with something without trying to extract value from it. No lesson, no takeaway, just presence. Part 13 offers that. Now let's talk about presence, because presence is not attention. Attention is effortful. Presence is passive. You don't have to focus to be present. You just have to not leave. And you've stayed long enough. Now let's revisit the dead one last time, but without names, without methods, without systems. Just as a collective quiet. They are not asking for justice. They are not demanding memory. They are simply part of the long human background. And that's okay. Now let's talk about background, because background is where most of life lives.
foreground moments feel important, but background moments sustain everything. History, when told loudly, stays in the foreground. History, when told softly, becomes background. And background is where it belongs. Now, imagine a future listener again. They don't know how many parts came before this. They don't care. They listen for the tone, the steadiness, and that's enough. Now, let's gently discuss why the mind relaxes when nothing is resolved. Resolution demands effort. Unresolved, accepted calmly, demands nothing. That's why the mind loosens its grip. That's why sleep comes easier. Now, let's slow this to the lowest possible pace. No ideas to remember, no threads to follow. Just the sound of a voice moving steadily forward. That's all this needs to be. Now, here's something very quiet, but important. You are allowed to enjoy history without carrying it. You are allowed to listen without remembering. You are allowed to drift. That permission matters. Now, let's approach the end of this part, not as a finish, but as a dimming. Not darkness, just less light. The kind that lets the eyes rest. History doesn't disappear when the lights dim. It just stops asking to be seen. And that's the most peaceful state it can reach. So tonight, let this be background noise for your thoughts. Let sentences blur together. Let meaning soften. You don't need to hold on to anything here. It's already done its work. The night is quiet. The story is calm. And nothing more is required. Stay as long as you like. Or don't. Either way, history will remain exactly where it is. Waiting.
Hey guys, welcome back. This part lives in a strange hour. Not night, not morning. The kind of time where the world hasn't decided what it's doing yet, and neither have you. Part 14 is not here to wake you up, and it's not here to put you fully to sleep either. It's here to hover, to stay in that soft in-between, where thoughts drift without direction and nothing asks to be finished. So, settle in again. No need to adjust anything. If you're comfortable, you're already doing it right. Let's begin with something that doesn't get talked about much. Staying. Most stories are built around movement, progress, change. But history spends most of its time staying in one place. Documents sit. Landscapes remain. Questions linger. We just don't notice that part, because staying doesn't announce itself. Earlier societies were very familiar with staying. They lived in the same places for generations. They told the same stories with minor changes. Modern life teaches us to move constantly. Scroll. Refresh. Update. Part 14 refuses to move. It stays. Now let's talk about what happens when nothing is added for a long time. Because this is when understanding shifts. At first, the mind searches for novelty, something new to latch onto. Then, slowly, it stops. And in that stopping, a different awareness appears. Not excitement, not insight, just calm recognition. This is where history stops being information and starts being atmosphere. Now think about how different this is from how history is usually presented. Dates, events, consequences. That style keeps the mind alert. But alertness isn't always the goal. Sometimes the goal is familiarity. To feel that the past is not rushing toward you, but sitting quietly nearby.
Now let's slow down and talk about time without urgency. Because urgency is mostly a modern invention. Earlier societies had deadlines, sure, but they didn't have constant acceleration. Seasons set the pace. Daylight set limits. There was built-in slowness. History moved at the speed of walking. Now it moves at the speed of retrieval. And retrieval feels urgent, even when it isn't. Part 14 takes retrieval away. There's nothing to retrieve here. Just space. Now let's gently revisit memory again, but from a different angle. Memory isn't a storage system. It's a filter. It keeps what fits and lets the rest drift. Modern systems don't filter well. They keep everything, which means humans have to do the filtering themselves. And that's tiring. So sometimes memory asks for help. It asks for quiet stories, repetitive rhythms, low stakes, stories that don't compete for importance. This part is one of those. Now let's talk about importance. Because importance changes over time. Things that once felt crucial become minor. Things that seemed minor become symbols. Importance is not fixed, which is why holding on to everything as equally important eventually collapses under its own weight. Earlier societies allowed decay to occur. We resist that now. But decay is not destruction. It's transformation. Now let's slow down further and talk about decay. Because decay has been misunderstood. Decay is often framed as loss. But decay is also how space opens up. Old leaves fall, so new growth has room. Old questions fade, so new ones can form. History decays naturally when we stop forcing it to stay sharp. Part 14 lets things dull gently. Now think about the long path you've walked through this series. At the beginning, things were concrete. Earth, water, bodies, places. Then came systems, records, science, data. And now the story has thinned out. Not because there's nothing left, but because the mind has absorbed what it needs. This thinning is intentional. It's where rest lives. Now let's talk about rest. Because rest is not the absence of thought. Rest is the absence of pressure. You can think while resting. You just don't have to arrive anywhere. That's what this part offers. Now let's gently consider why humans have always told long stories, especially at night. Not to teach, not to warn, but to regulate. Stories slow breathing. They smooth edges. They create a shared rhythm. Long before psychology had names for these things, people understood them intuitively. Sit by a fire. Speak softly. Repeat patterns. The body listens even when the mind drifts. Now let's talk about drifting. Because drifting is not losing control. Drifting is allowing the current to carry you for a while. Earlier we talked about rivers hiding bodies. Now think of rivers differently. Rivers don't erase everything. They move things gently until they belong somewhere else. Drifting is just movement without destination. And that's not dangerous. It's natural. Now let's revisit the idea of endings. Because this series keeps circling them without landing. Endings are useful for books. They're less useful for lived experience.
most things don't end. They soften. They become background. They stop asking for attention. History behaves the same way. And that's okay. Now let's talk about the background hum. Because this is where most of life sits. You don't notice the hum until it stops. History, when told loudly, demands attention. History, when told softly, becomes hum. Something you're aware of without focusing on it. That's the healthiest relationship with the past. Now let's imagine someone centuries from now again, but differently. They're not studying us intently. They're skimming. They glance. They move on. And that's not disrespect. That's normal. We do the same to those before us. Which means the anxiety of perfect preservation is unnecessary. The past doesn't need to be held tightly. It needs to be allowed. Now let's slow everything down even more. No new ideas. No reframing. Just continuation. Sentence after sentence. Steady and calm. This is intentional. Because repetition is soothing. The brain relaxes when it knows what's coming. And here's what's coming. Nothing surprising. Nothing urgent. Just more of the same gentle motion. Now let's talk about trust. Because this is what part 14 quietly asks for. Trust that you don't need to stay alert. Trust that nothing important will be missed if you drift. Trust that history doesn't punish you for stepping back. Earlier societies trusted this instinctively. We're relearning it slowly. Now let's talk about learning. Because learning doesn't always feel like accumulation. Sometimes learning feels like relief. Like realizing you don't need to know one more thing. That you've reached a comfortable plateau. Part 14 is that plateau. Now let's revisit the dead. Not as individuals, not as cases, but as continuity. They lived, they passed. The world adjusted, just like it always has. No moral, no lesson, just process. And process doesn't require commentary. Now let's talk about commentary.
Hey guys, welcome back. This part doesn't arrive. It's already here. Part 15 lives in the place where you stop wondering how many parts there have been and stop caring how many might come next. The counting fades. The need for structure loosens. This is the part where history becomes familiar furniture. You don't analyze it anymore. You just know where it is. So settle in again. No preparation needed. You've done this enough times now. Let's begin with something very gentle. Routine. Routine doesn't get enough credit. It's not exciting. It doesn't feel meaningful. But routine is where the nervous system relaxes. Earlier societies lived inside routine. Seasons repeated. Tasks returned. Stories came back around with small variations. Modern life pretends to hate routine while secretly craving it. This series has quietly become one, and that's a good thing. Now let's talk about what happens when a story stops teaching and starts accompanying. At first, stories give information. Then they give perspective. Eventually, they give rhythm. You're not listening for content anymore. You're listening for steadiness. That's where part 15 lives. Now think about how different this is from the beginning. Back then, there were ideas to track, images to hold, methods to remember. Now, the details barely matter. And that's not loss, that's integration. Now let's slow down and talk about integration, because integration is quieter than learning. Learning adds something. Integration rearranges what's already there. It doesn't feel dramatic. It feels like things clicking into a more comfortable position. History, when integrated, stops being heavy. It becomes background understanding. Now let's talk about background again, because background is the safest place for difficult things. Foreground demands reaction. Background allows coexistence. Earlier societies kept most of history in the background. Modern culture drags it into the foreground constantly. Part 15 gently nudges it back. Now let's revisit time one more time, but without metaphor. Time passes. That's it. No lesson, no interpretation. Earlier societies accepted this easily. We keep trying to annotate it. But annotation isn't required for existence. Now let's slow down even further. Imagine a room you've been in many times. You don't notice every object anymore. You just feel comfortable. That's what this part is trying to be. A room you don't need to look around. Now let's talk about attention, because attention is effort. You've been paying attention for a long time now. Part 15 doesn't ask for that. It allows partial listening, drifting, coming back, leaving again. This is intentional, because the mind needs permission to loosen its grip. Now let's gently think about the past, not as something behind us, but as something alongside us. It's not chasing, it's not calling out, it's just there, sometimes visible, sometimes not, and it doesn't panic when ignored. Now let's talk about panic, because panic is what happens when we think something will vanish if we don't watch it. The past doesn't vanish, it changes shape. It waits in different forms. Earlier societies trusted this. We're learning to trust it again. Now let's revisit the dead one more time, but with the least possible weight. They lived. They were part of patterns larger than themselves. Their significance doesn't depend on our vigilance. They don't require constant remembrance to remain real. This idea is strangely comforting. Now let's talk about comfort, because comfort is often misunderstood. Comfort isn't excitement. It isn't distraction. Comfort is predictability without boredom. It's knowing nothing bad will suddenly be demanded of you. This part is built to be comforting. Now let's slow the language down. Short sentences, even rhythm, no surprises. This is not laziness, it's care. Now let's gently consider why humans return to the same stories even when they know how they go. Not for information, for reassurance. The reassurance that things follow patterns, that chaos is not total, that familiarity exists. History, when stripped of drama, offers this reassurance. Now let's talk about drama, because drama is overstimulating. Drama sharpens attention, raises heart rate. Night stories do the opposite. They flatten peaks. They smooth edges. They let the body release tension. Part 15 is intentionally flat, and that flatness is a feature. Now let's imagine the future again, but this time without analysis. Someone exists. They don't know you. They don't know this moment. They live anyway. History will pass through them in some form, just like it passed through you. No ceremony, no obligation, just continuity. Now let's talk about continuity, because continuity is the real protagonist of history, not heroes, not villains, just things continuing. Language, habit, storytelling. This series is part of that, and it doesn't need to be more than that. Now let's slow everything down until there's almost nothing left to slow. Breathing steadies, thoughts stretch.
The words become texture instead of meaning. This is where night sleep-friendly history belongs. Now let's gently approach the end of part 15, not as an ending, but as a soft thinning. The way conversation fades when no one rushes to speak. The way a room grows quieter without anyone turning the light off. Nothing is being concluded. Nothing is being promised. This part simply exists and then stops asking for attention. So, if you're awake, that's fine. If you've drifted, that's fine too. This part doesn't need completion. It doesn't need to be remembered. It's done its job simply by being here with you. The night continues. The story remains calm, and you don't need to do anything else.
Hey guys, welcome back. And welcome to the last place this story needs to go. This is part 16, the final part. Not a finale, not a conclusion, just a long exhale. There's nothing dramatic waiting here. No lesson tying itself into a bow. No final revelation clearing its throat. This part exists for one simple reason: to let everything rest. So wherever you are, however you're listening, however much attention you have left, that's already enough. Let's begin slowly, slower than before, because nothing is chasing us now. There's a strange relief that comes when a story announces it's finished. Not because it's over, but because it no longer asks anything from you. No more tracking, no more remembering, no more wondering if you missed something important. Part 16 doesn't need to justify itself. It's here to sit quietly with you, the way a room does after everyone else has gone home. Earlier parts moved through time, through bodies, through systems, through knowledge. This one doesn't move at all. It stays. Let's talk gently about stopping. Stopping is uncomfortable for modern minds. We're taught that stopping means failure, that rest must be earned, that endings need explanation. Earlier cultures didn't think this way. They stopped when things felt complete, not resolved, just complete enough. A day ended because the light left. The story ended because the voice grew tired. No apology required. Part 16 ends because the story has reached that same natural tiredness. And that's not a weakness. That's wisdom. Now let's talk about silence, because silence has been slowly approaching this entire time. Not empty silence, not awkward silence, comfortable silence, the kind where nothing feels missing. Silence isn't the opposite of story. It's what stories eventually return to. Words rise, words do their work, then they dissolve back into quiet. That's the full cycle, and we're right at that point now. Think back to the beginning of this series. There was curiosity, strangeness, darkness handled gently. You were listening forward then. Now you're listening downward, toward rest, toward stillness, toward that place where thoughts stop lining up and start floating. This is intentional, because stories don't need to be held forever. They need to be released. Let's talk softly about release. Release doesn't mean forgetting. It means trusting that what mattered will stay without effort. Your mind knows how to keep what it needs. You don't have to supervise it. Earlier societies trusted memory to do its job quietly. They didn't cling to every detail. They allowed meaning to settle on its own. Part 16 is built on that trust. Now let's talk about the past, one last time, but without weight. The past is not heavy by default. We make it heavy by gripping it too tightly. When we loosen our hands, it becomes lighter. Not trivial, just manageable. The people before us lived. They struggled. They adapted. They rested. And then they became background. Not erased, integrated.
This is the most respectful place history can live. Let's slow the pace even more. No new ideas now, just continuation. Sentence after sentence. Even, soft, predictable. This rhythm isn't accidental. The brain relaxes when it senses closure approaching without threat. This is that moment. Now let's talk about completion, because completion is quieter than accomplishment. Accomplishment wants applause. Completion wants stillness. Completion doesn't announce itself. You feel it in the body, a loosening of the jaw, a deeper breath, a sense that nothing else needs to be done. If you feel that now, you're exactly where you should be. Think about how rarely modern life allows something to simply end. There's always a sequel, an update, a rework. Part 16 refuses that. Not out of stubbornness, out of kindness. Because sometimes the most generous thing a story can do is stop. Let's talk gently about night, because night has been our companion the whole time. Night lowers expectations. It doesn't demand productivity. It doesn't care about progress. Night allows things to exist without purpose. That's why night stories work. They align with the body's natural desire to soften. Part 16 belongs fully to the night. Now imagine this story as a room. You've been sitting in it for a while. It's familiar now. You know where everything is. And at some point, you realize you don't need to stay. Not because you're being pushed out, but because you're comfortable enough to leave. The room remains. You just don't need to be in it anymore. Let's talk about gratitude, briefly, and without ceremony. Not gratitude as obligation, gratitude as quiet acknowledgement. This story existed. You were here for it. That's enough. Nothing more is required. Now let's approach the ending slowly. So slowly it barely feels like movement. The words will keep coming for a bit, but they're thinning now, becoming lighter, less defined. You don't need to hold on to them. You can let them pass through. If your eyes are closed, let them stay that way. If your thoughts are wandering, let them wander. This part doesn't need you fully present. Partial listening is perfect. Drifting is welcome. There will be no final sentence that tells you how to feel. No summary of themes. No reminder of what came before. That's intentional, because endings that explain themselves don't trust the listener. This one trusts you completely. So, here we are. At the end that doesn't insist on being remembered. At the story that doesn't ask for continuation. At the quiet place where nothing else needs to happen. If you're awake, rest. If you're asleep, rest deeper. If you come back to this part someday, it will still be here. Unchanged. Unbothered. Calm. The story doesn't disappear when it ends. It simply stops speaking. And silence takes over. That's not empty.